Good evening, everybody, and welcome to Power Parsha Pearls. This week's portion, we're going to be discussing further on the Exodus from Egypt, because this week we read the culmination of the Exodus as the Jewish nation are finally free from their taskmasters and we are born into nationhood. And as a result, of course, we commemorate this event each year with the celebration of Pesach, and we do so in particular by marking both the beginning and the end. The beginning of Pesach in the first instance being very specific to the Exodus from Egypt, and on the seventh day of Pesach, reflecting in particular the crossing of the sea, as we read about in this week's portion. So the question is this: the highlight of the Seder. You ask anybody, Pesach, what's the first thing that comes to mind? And the first thing they'll tell you is matzah. It's a highlight of the Seder. So remember the fact there was no time for the flour to rise. They hastily left Egypt, and you have to wonder. So there was no time for the dough to rise. Mazel tov, it was just food. There are so many ways that we could reflect on the actual Exodus, on the swift and hurried nature of our redemption. Why do we choose to do so specifically by resorting to such a gastronomic ordeal of the eating of the matzah? And the answer I suggest to you is perhaps because matzah encapsulates the real message and the takeaway from the Egypt story. And it is this: ever since we experienced the Exodus, we've been enjoined by the ancient rabbis to always reflect on it as a personal experience. In their words, in every generation, man and woman is supposed to see him or herself as though they personally left Egypt. Sounds good in principle. In practice, it's pretty impossible. You know why? Because we live in one of two societies. We live either in a free world where we've been raised, educated, built families, jobs, a life, and so we're already free. Or we live maybe in an oppressive regime under some communism, some dictatorship, whereby we aren't free at all. Whichever way you cut it, this requirement to see ourselves as though we are leaving Egypt doesn't really make sense. It doesn't quite work. But that's only if you see Egypt as a geographical location. In that context, indeed, re-experiencing the Exodus is a rather far-fetched proposition. But then there's an altogether different kind of Egypt. You see, the Hebrew word for Egypt is Mitzrayim. And those letters make up the same word as Meitzarim, which means constriction, restraint, limitation. Sure, there was a physical enslavement in Mitzrayim in Egypt, from which we were redeemed, but there's also a psychological or emotional Meitzarim, confinement, which many of us are still enslaved to. Ask yourself the following question: are you free? When you look in the mirror and you take a deep, hard look at your soul, what do you see? Do you see freedom or do you see inhibition? Do you feel free, or are you trapped in settings or conditions that leave you feeling overwhelmed? Isaiah Berlin actually once famously analyzed two dimensions to liberty. He actually explained that there's a concept of negative liberty, otherwise known as freedom from, and there's positive liberty, otherwise described as freedom to. You can be free from certain impositions in your life, but what happens next? What are you free to do? If you're aimless, if you're directionless, you've only experienced negative liberty, but not positive liberty. You're only halfway there. The story is incomplete. And as such, you're not truly free. Again, consider the Jews in Egypt. Sure, they experienced an exodus. They were free from their persecution, but then what? Where do they go? What do they do? I'm no longer shackled to my taskmaster, but what am I supposed to do with my life now? I'm free from captivity, but free to do what? Hence God's specific instruction to Moshe, right from their first communication at the burning bush. You will free these people so that they will then serve God on this mountain. The Exodus from Egypt was liberty from their pain and suffering. Mount Sinai was their liberty to. The liberty to now embrace a meaningful way of life. The liberty to experience something altogether different. Their liberty to have meaning and purpose by which they're able to properly connect to God. That was the ultimate point and purpose of the Exodus. In life, we may be desperate to be free from, sorry about that, don't know why that's happening. We may be desperate to be free from some of the experiences that we endure. But in itself, escaping our current condition, which might be the right thing to do, might be necessary up until a certain point, we'll always still feel somewhat frustrated unless there's a follow-up, an end goal, a bigger picture. Howard Hughes was in his time the wealthiest man in the world, worth more than $2 billion back then. You'd readily assume he was certainly a free man, but his wealth generated so much anxiety. Everywhere he went, guards. He couldn't even trust his guards. When he ate, he feared his food was being poisoned. When he walked, he feared getting shot. Eventually, he became a recluse on the top floor of the Desert Inn in Las Vegas. And that's pretty much how he lived out his life. Always fearful. When he traveled, he had to go into a blanket because he was worried that somebody was going to assassinate him. So you might assume for yourself that maybe he was free, but by no means was he in actual fact free. In fact, he lived in that top floor of the Desert Inn in Las Vegas until he died in 1976. Not only did his $2 billion not deliver him freedom, it transformed him into, if you will, the bitterest slave possible. Some people allow for their material trappings to keep them shackled to a life that offers no freedom of the soul. True liberty is experienced only when you feel your soul can breathe and you can walk with a spring in your step. How often do we find ourselves unthinkingly enslaving ourselves by becoming boxed by other people's expectations of us? You know what? Over the weekend, ask yourself, how many of your decisions are dictated by what you truly desire, and how many of them have been dictated by other conditions or by other people? We tend to define freedom as the ability to make our own choices, when in essence, what we think is freedom is simply the ability to choose our own masters, rather than letting them choose us. We are free from, but to what extent are we free to? And that takes us back to the matzah. The plain flour and water matzah is stripped of all external elements. Nothing is influencing the flour. Nothing is adding flavor to it. Nothing is attached to the matzah. No external ingredients. It symbolizes the basic minimum of human existence, a state in which one is defined by nothing other than their essential identity. You have a unique soul within you. That's your essence, your true self. That soul needs nurturing. It needs developing. In Egypt, that soul was controlled. It was impeded. It was cramped. And that may be the reality for many people today as well. So the Exodus story reminds us how we have the power to set ourselves free from. The matzah reminds us how we must also have the freedom to. The directive for each of us to leave Egypt is to know that we have to decide internally that we want and must be free, free to be you at your best, at your truest, at your freest. And then you can flap your wings and you can reach your destiny, whatever it is that you want to achieve in life. Now, next week, we also celebrate Tu B'Shvat, the 15th day of Shabbat, in 4 days' time. It's what we commonly refer to as the New Year for trees. By definition, just as there is a time in the year when God looks into the inner recesses of our souls and determines our fate for the coming year, so on this day, God judges and determines how many trees are going to grow in the coming year, how much fruit is going to be produced on those trees, and so on and so forth. We celebrate, of course, because trees in and of themselves are important. They produce oxygen, they reduce carbon dioxide, they prevent erosion, they provide weather-sheltered ecosystems under their foliage. We all benefit from the wood they provide for building our homes, our furniture, and even the very prayer books that we hold in our hands wouldn't be without trees. But there's something more about trees, and thus the significance of the day as it relates to us individually, because the Torah very curiously states, for man is like a tree of the field. There's something about a tree that gives us cause to pause and reflect on some truth about our own essence. Consider, a tree consists of roots, body and fruit. The roots anchor the tree to the earth. The body is the essence of the tree, the trunk, the branches, and the fruit is that which the tree produces for others to benefit from, and from which seeds ultimately emerge to enable new trees to grow. Is that then not the reality of our lives? Roots, branches, fruit, past, present, and future. We have roots, the foundations upon which our lives are built, our history, our parents, our grandparents, the families which we stem from, the footsteps in which we walk. Those roots are what keep us anchored so long as we're prepared to look back and remember where we come from so we can get a better vision of where we should be headed. The trunk and the branches, that's who we are. Some tree trunks are stronger, others are weaker. Some sway in the wind, others remain steadfast. We branch out, we extend ourselves, some more, others less. Some branches are bent, others are straight. Some have leaves today which will fall tomorrow. Others maintain consistency throughout. The entity of the tree reflects our different personalities and characters and the way we express ourselves in our present-day reality. And then there's the fruit. We don't, after all, live only for ourselves. We look to bear fruit, impact others, to raise others, to inspire others, to touch another soul, or even within our own families. You know, the Torah is very emphatic that even when in battle and conquering a city, you're not allowed to destroy the fruit trees in that city because it represents the most important aspect of being a human being, namely giving to others. The entire raison d'etre of a fruit tree is to give off fruit. Each of us, according to our own talents, circumstances, must seek to do the same. We could have strong roots which run deep and a solid trunk that stands firm, but if we don't plan for the future, then it's futile. And thus the custom actually is to eat fruit on Tu B'Shvat, on the 15th of Shvat, and in particular the fruits with which the land of Israel is blessed, namely dates, figs, pomegranates. Israel, like the tree, has long roots which run deep and traces itself back to the days of our forefathers, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and our ancestors who settled in the land thereafter. Like a tree, Israel has to seek to maintain a strong trunk, a firm branch in its present state so as to withstand the gusts and the threatening winds that all too often seek to consume it, not just in its particular geographical location, but equally in government buildings, university campuses, and wherever else hostility blows all around the world. But above all, it needs to bear fruit. No country can survive just concentrating on its present state without taking into account its future, without bearing in mind the next generation that will reap then what is sown now. A tree needs tranquility, serenity, purpose, proper nurturing so it bears healthy fruit, which in turn secures its perpetuity. And finally, the Medrash observes there are three types of shade. The shade of a bird, which is fleeting as it passes over. The shade of a wall, which is manifest in the morning when the sun rises and in the evening when the sun sets. And the shade of a tree, which is constant throughout. Every human being makes an impact. We each cast our own shadow on the world, if you will. There are those people that might be alive, they walk the streets, they shop in stores, they work in an office building, they live in a home, but do they make a dent? How often do people say, oh, where has the time gone? Like the passing bird, the shadow, the impact, it's transient. If your impression is enduring, you'll see where the time is in the permanence of your imprint. The shadow of the wall, on the other hand, it has some permanence. It's seen in the early hours of the morning or the late hours of the afternoon, but it's limited. In the midday sun, it fades. There are those who in their early youth or young adulthood are full of zest and energy, and in their twilight years, life is tranquil and calm. That's where they are ready to give of themselves. When the sun is burning brightest during those pivotal years in between, they're too caught up in their own lives so as to neglect bringing shade to others. They're just a little bit too busy for family, for community. Only those who need the shade and comfort now don't need it as much when your sun starts to set, or when their sun starts to set. Finally, there is the shade of a tree where you can always find comfort. Whatever time of day, all through life, a person remembers that they're an ambassador, and that therefore an ambassador of God, no matter where they are standing in life, whether the sun is rising, whether the sun is setting, whether the sun is in full glow, such a person never fails to lead, to serve as an agent of love, of hope, and trust to others. And apart from the special fruit of Israel that we eat on the day, many have the custom to actually eat carob, sometimes known as boxer. I don't know if you've seen it, but to be honest, it doesn't really taste all that edible. And kids all over the world are cracking molars right and left, but it's commonly included in our Tu B'Shvat fare. The reason for this goes back to a fascinating Talmudic tale of a rabbi called Chuni, who observed a man planting a carob tree. And he said, how long will it take for the tree to grow? And the man said, 70 years. And the rabbi said, isn't it obvious you're not going to be around here to bear the fruits of your labor? To which the man said, just as I was born into a world containing strong, full-grown carob trees planted by my ancestors, I'm now planting for the next generation. Roots, ancestors are important. The trunk, the branches, health and strength is vital, but it is the fruit, the future that is paramount. Everything learned, everything done, every aspiration, every accomplishment must always be nurtured with that goal in mind. And so, yes, we celebrate Tu B'Shvat, an otherwise incredibly minor, seemingly minor festival, but it's a timely reminder that man is like a tree in the field in all of its glory, remembering one's duty to their past, to those around them, to loved ones, to community, to our nation, and indeed to our world. I wish you all a Shabbat Shalom.